Hey everyone, this is a piece by Willy Huhn from his collection Trotsky the Failed Stalin, and the piece is titled On the Theory of the quote, Worker State in Russia. It's from 1952. And again, I'm using a Google Translate to translate a page from German, so a lot of this might not be perfectly correct. So here we are. Section 1. Natalia Trotsky has followed the example of Lenin's widow, Krupskaya, just as Krupskaya once turned against the quote, Leninists in the name of Lenin, so in May 1951, Natalia Trotsky did against the quote, Trotskyists. The German text of Trotsky's wife's renunciation of the Fourth International was recently published, from which it emerges that it is above all the Trotskyist maintenance of the definition of the Stalinist state as a, quote, worker state that caused Natalia Trotsky to break away from the Fourth International. She refused to recognize both Russia and the states of Eastern Europe under pressure from Russian troops as, quote, workers' states, and thus to recognize the Stalinist bureaucracy in these countries as playing a progressive role and even revolutionary role. But what seems most intolerable of all to Natalia Trotsky is the Fourth International's position on war, i.e. the position that in the event of a Third World War, the Stalinist state should be defended by the international working class. It was with great bitterness that Natalia Trotsky read in the messages from the last meeting of the Socialist Workers' Party, I guess that's the U.S. Party, the Socialist Workers' Party, that Trotsky's ideas would continue to guide the Fourth International, because Trotsky himself would hardly maintain this thesis of the, quote, worker state today, parenthesis, May 9th, 1951, in parenthesis, when Stalin had left nothing of the socialist fatherland. The Trotskyists, of course, did not fail to respond. On the 29th of May, 1951, the Socialist Workers' Party in New York addressed a statement to Natalia Trotsky in which it admitted that the question of the workers' state was being discussed again and that the Socialist Workers' Party had not yet made up its mind on this point. But it did say that, quote, we continue to defend the planned economy, end quote. Quote, we continue to defend the planned economy, end quote. Natalia Trotsky's arguments against the definition of the USSR as a, quote, degenerate worker state, end quote, were merely a repetition of the arguments put forward by the, quote, petty bourgeois opposition, end quote, led by Burnham and Shachtman in 1939 and 1940. Natalia Trotsky's position presupposed the conviction that the Soviet Union had become a capitalist state. However, the Socialist Workers' Party prefers to, quote, preserve Trotsky's method and views, end quote, and thus the political line that combined the, quote, defense of the planned economy, end quote, in Russia with the, quote, irreconcilable opposition to Stalinism, end quote. It quotes, in a cautious section, exclamation point, a few paragraphs from Trotsky with his position on Russian foreign and war policy during the Second World War and adds, quote, 11 years later, we see no reason whatsoever to change our opinion on this or any similar course, end quote. The American Trotskyists continued by declaring that they are, quote, students of L.D. Trotsky, end quote, and that his explanation of the character of the Soviet Union and Stalinism won them over to his banner. They expressed the conviction that outside the movement founded by Trotsky, quote, there are no serious revolutionary forces on an international scale today, end quote. As much as we are inclined to share Natalia Trotsky's view of the character of Stalinist Russia, we fear that it is not the Trotskyists, but Trotsky's wife who has deviated from, quote, Trotskyism. We fear that it is not the Trotskyists, but Trotsky's wife who has deviated from, quote, Trotskyism. New section. Section 2. The historian always has a double worry. Firstly, the incompleteness and unreliability of the documents and sources. Secondly, the fact that the results of his research are often contradicted by certain myths or legends that make them unpopular. The myth of the Russian Revolution goes something like this. As the conclusion of a great, uncompromising policy based on the program and organizational form of the Leninist Party, an armed uprising was planned in October 1917 under the leadership of the Bolsheviks, which after its victorious conclusion realized the intended dictatorship of the proletariat and thus enabled and initiated the construction of a socialist social order. The abundance of historical facts that contradict this legend is simply incalculable. For example, there is first of all the fact that there was no Russian capitalism. Parenthesis, we mean a modern industrial one, end parenthesis. But there was a foreign capitalism in Russia. Quote, in Russia, capital is created by means of the finance capital of Western Europe, ... Finance capital penetrated into our country from other countries, France, Germany, England, etc., and created gigantic factories suddenly in an empty spot somewhere, ... in the whole of the South and Southwest, ... Western European capital transplanted entire factories and plants here and anchored them at once, end quote. I'm not sure if that's a Trotsky quote or who that quote is from. The expropriation of this capital therefore meant nationalization in the truest sense of the word, and in this respect the Russian Revolution was a national revolution, directed primarily against the French, German, and English capitalists, and not so much against the domestic industrial bourgeoisie. Even before the revolution, the latter, quote, possessed no political power, end quote, in Russia. Quote, no bourgeoisie is ever possessed any special influence in our country, end quote. It is, ... Trotsky, who makes these statements, pointing out the total dependence of the miserable Russian bourgeoisie on the international, quote, immense financial power, end quote. If Trotsky knew this, how could he expect and ask for concessions from the military representatives of German finance capital and help from the military representatives of French and English finance capital before Brest-Litovsk, parenthesis, March 1918, end parenthesis. But it is the certainly unsuspected Captain Jacques Sadoul, then a member of the French military mission in Russia, who tells us, quote, in December 1917, sorry, one second. This is Jacques Sadoul. Quote, in December 1917, January, February 1918, probably 20 times, Lenin and Trotsky, crushed by the threats of the parenthesis, German and parenthesis, enemy, unable to restore the disbanded Russian army alone, demanded, through my mediation, the support of the Allied missions and the military forces of the Entente. For this cooperation, they set a single condition: assurance that the Allies would not touch the existence of the workers' and peasants' government. The Entente representatives always met these desperate demands with a formal no, end quote. Jacques Sadoul. Wikipedia says Jacques Sadoul lived from 1881 to 1956. Jacques Sadoul was a French lawyer, communist politician, and writer, one of the founders of the Communist International. Jacques Sadoul began his career in the French section of the Workers' International, SFIO, in Vienna. Vienne. And by the time of World War I was serving under Albert Thomas, the Minister of Armaments. a French army captain, Jacques Sadoul, was Thomas's envoy to the Russian Republic, keeping contact with the socialist circles and steering them toward the Entente powers. After the October Revolution, Jacques Sadoul maintained close contacts with the Bolsheviks, pledging them his support against the Central Powers during the crisis of 1917 to 1918. Jacques Sadoul was unable to prevent Bolshevist Russia from signing the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, which took her out of the war, but having established close contacts with Leon Trotsky and other communist leaders, became a communist himself. Opting not to return to France during the Russian Civil War, Sadoul co-founded the French Communist Group in Russia, fighting for control of it against Pierre Pascal and Henri Guilbeault. Helping to set up the Red Army, Jacques Sadoul was sent to Ukraine, where Jacques Sadoul instigated mutinies among the French intervention troops, and then to Germany, where he set up communist cells. Jacques Sadoul also mediated between the International and the SFIO's left wing, attracting members for what became the French Communist Party, and contributed doctrinaire essays in La Humanité. A French military court sentenced Jacques Sadoul to death in absentia, while the SFIO presented Jacques Sadoul symbolically as a candidate in the 1919 elections. Finally moving back to France in 1924 and acquitted upon retrial, Sadoul remained at the center of controversy. Sadoul joined the PCF, but failed to win any elections, and was generally marginalized by the party leadership. A Stalinist apologist and Izvestia correspondent in the 1930s, Jacques Sadoul helped the Soviet Union maintain contacts with the French establishment and represented Soviet interests in France. Jacques Sadoul was pressured into collaborationism with Vichy France during World War II, but openly returned to communism in 1944 and ended his career in politics as mayor of Saint-Maxime. Back to the text. Another fact. The Bolsheviks had barely thrown off their dependence on foreign finance capital when they were already trying to attract new foreign capital. As early as January 1918, the director of the Nya banks in Stockholm, Aschberg, was in Russia on business to obtain an export license for a large batch of machine oil from the Bolsheviks. Wikipedia says, Olaf Aschberg lived from 1877 to 1960 and was a Swedish banker of Russian Jewish descent who served as head of the Stockholm bank Nya Banken, the first bank in Sweden for trade unions and cooperatives. Olaf Aschberg, from August 18, 1922 on, served as the Director General of Roscombank, which was later transformed into Vnesheconombank. Aschberg was a leftist sympathizer and helped finance the Bolsheviks during the Russian Revolution. In gratitude, the Bolshevik government allowed Aschberg to do business with the Soviet Union during the 1920s, as was consistent with the new economic policy. Aschberg's co-directors included prominent Swedish cooperatives and Swedish socialists, including G.W. Dahl, K.G. Rosling, and C. Gerhard Magnusson. Back to the text. Aschberg reported his impressions of the Bolshevik business partners to the editor of the left-wing socialist newspaper Politiken in Stockholm, saying that he had been able to convince himself that finance capital could conduct very advantageous operations with the Bolsheviks. Another fact is that Lenin and Trotsky wanted to transfer the German war economy of 1914 to 1918 to Russia, with the help of the, quote, workers' and peasants' government, end quote, which is essentially the end of all the socialism of their first economic measures. But to come to the, quote, workers' state, it was Lenin himself who, in December 1930, on December 30th, 1920, declared the, quote, workers' state to be an abstraction, since the Bolshevik state was, quote, not quite a workers' state, end quote, namely a, quote, workers' state with bureaucratic excesses, end quote. Lenin. On trade unions. But one can only speak of a workers' state or the dictatorship of the proletariat in the Bolshevik sense if it is realized through a dictatorship of the party. Then the riddle of Bukharin's statement at the 10th Party Congress of the Russian Communist Party in March 1921 is also solved. If one wanted to be serious about a, quote, workers' democracy, quote, the dictatorship of the proletariat could not last for a second, end quote. It is, quote, only carried out by the, quote, vanguard of the working class, end quote, the Bolshevik Party. But at the same party congress at which workers' democracy was rejected, Lenin had to admit that one was too weak to wage a decisive struggle against those, quote, bureaucratic excesses, end quote, of the workers' state. In view of such facts from the first years of the Bolshevik Party dictatorship, what does the... All right, I'll see you when you get back. Okay. In view of such facts from the first years of the Bolshevik Party dictatorship, what does the definition of it as a, quote, workers' state mean? To which economic structure does it refer? Section 3. When the Trotskyist opposition in Russia still expresses the firm conviction in its appeal to the Sixth Congress of the Comintern, 1928, that, quote, the real leader of Soviet power is still the proletariat, end quote, this does not mean much, or rather it only means that the vanguard of the working class, i.e. the Bolshevik Party, still leads Soviet power. When asked about the economic structure of the socialism that is supposedly being built in Russia, Trotsky does give a number of answers that seem sufficient for the present purpose. Trotsky speaks of the, quote, tremendous advantages, end quote, that, quote, arise from the socialist revolution, end quote, and cites as such the, quote, nationalization of the land, the means of production, the banks, and the central administrative organs. End quote. What are we to understand by nationalization of the central administrative organs? But not the implementation of the Bolshevik Party program point that recommended the obligatory integration of every Soviet member into a specific function in the state administration. In any case, the, quote, tremendous advantages, end quote, of the socialist revolution of 1917 are concentrated in a single point, nationalization. So when Trotsky and his followers assured the Comintern that, quote, any of our supporters who denies the proletarian character of our party and our state and the socialist character of the construction of the Soviet Union will be ruthlessly fought by us and removed from our ranks, end quote. Trotsky. Then this must mean that the socialist character of the economic construction in Russia is guaranteed by nationalization, the proletarian character of the state or the dictatorship of the proletariat, and this by the dictatorship of the party, which is still supposed to be the vanguard of the proletariat. Nevertheless, Trotsky polemicized against Molotov's, quote, theory that one cannot demand that the workers be drawn to the state and the state to the worker, because the state is already in itself a workers' state. As, quote, the most malicious bureaucratic formula that one can imagine, end quote. Perhaps Molotov was only drawing an ironic conclusion from Trotsky's theses cited. But when Stalin pushed through his thesis of, quote, building socialism in one country, end quote, Trotsky significantly limited the impact of the, quote, socialist revolution and the, quote, socialist character of the Russian economic development. While Stalin had claimed that socialism had already been achieved 9/10 in Russia, parenthesis, he was evidently following a statement by Lenin, end parenthesis. Trotsky declared that after the Sixth Comintern Congress on the Comintern program, that instead of telling this lie, the Russian proletariat should be told that, quote, at present, parenthesis, 1928, end parenthesis, our economic level, with our economic level and with our conditions of existence and culture, we are much closer to a capitalist, and at the same time backwards and uncivilized capitalist society than to a socialist society. And at the same time backward and uncivilized capitalist society, at the same time a backward and Jesus Christ, I fucked this whole thing up. Quote, at present, with our economic level and with our conditions of existence and culture, we are much closer to a capitalist, and at the same time backward and uncivilized capitalist society than to a socialist society, end quote. Trotsky maintained that socialism could only be built in Russia if the proletariat seized power in the more advanced countries. Finally, Trotsky went so far in his criticism of Stalinism that he declared Stalin's victory not only as the triumph of the more moderate, conservative, bureaucratic, and nationalist tendencies, but even as the, quote, victory of the supporters of private property, end quote. And this brings us to an interesting point. Trotsky can only imagine a, quote, degeneration, end quote, in the direction of regression. That is, in the form of the old, quote, classical, end quote, parenthesis, liberal, end parenthesis, capitalism based on private property. For Trotsky, quote, the Soviet system is above all a new system of economic or, quote, property relations. The Soviet system is essentially, a question of property, of land, banks, mines, and railways. It is essentially a question of property, of land, banks, mines, and railways, end quote. If private ownership of the means of production, distribution, and communication is restored, we will return to capitalism. But as long as state ownership of them remains, quote, socialist, foundations still exist in Russia. In this respect, there's not even a fundamental difference with Stalinism. The Stalinists also support the thesis that, quote, with the abolition of private ownership, the entire pyramid of capitalism and with capitalism exploitation will collapse, end quote. I don't know who this quote is, but the footnote says, see the report on the lecture of Russian Major Sokolka, Socialism or State Capitalism in Taglicher Rundschau, Berlin, number 122, May 29th, 1947. This lecture was directed against Comrade Franz Rother, Munich, now in Augsburg. End footnote. In Trotsky's view, statism and socialism are still one and the same. Trotsky finally characterized the theory of building socialism in one country as, quote, Stalinist National Socialism, end quote, and compared the depth of Stalinism's departure from the Marxist conception of building socialism with the attitude of German social democracy towards war and patriotism in August 1914. Quote, this juxtaposition is not accidental. The, quote, error of Stalin and the, quote, error of the German social democracy means National Socialism, end quote. Trotsky. I think that's from My Life. I'm not sure, though. We are therefore happy to admit that Trotsky was not a national statist. Not a national statist. But even in Trotsky's preface to the German edition of his Permanent Revolution of March 29, 1930, Trotsky still saw, quote, the strength of the Soviet economy, in the nationalization of the means of production, and in their systematic use, end quote. Trotsky. The Permanent Revolution. Here, too, the state-planned economy appears as the positive foundation of socialist construction in Russia. Trotsky apparently opposed the theory of building socialism in one country primarily because Trotsky did not like the economic or political autarky that it entailed. Trotsky stressed the need to undertake the economic reconstruction of Russia in the closest possible contact with the capitalist world economy, and rejected the restriction of the Comintern to an organ for the defense of the Soviet Union in the sense of a purely defensive policy against possible interventions. Trotsky indignantly pointed out Varga's opinion that the theory of socialism in one country was nonsense, but necessary to encourage the workers. Quote, a priestly deception is salvation, end quote. When the second year of the first 5-year plan in Russia was publicly characterized as meaning that the Russian economy had already entered the period of socialism, Trotsky again vigorously opposed the thesis put forward that, quote, socialism, had already been realized in its foundations, end quote. If one looks at the Soviet life of today, parenthesis, 1931, end parenthesis, the everyday life of the working masses, the level of culture, and the still existing degree of illiteracy, then one must honestly admit that, quote, that the conditions, of the overwhelming majority of the country's population are there's a typo here. So I think it means are with the legacy of bourgeois czarist Russia and contain barely 5% elements of socialism, end quote. Trotsky. Trotsky's, quote, conclusions from the analysis of Russia at that time therefore emphasized that the collective farms should not be identified with socialism. The current transitional economy in the Soviet Union, parenthesis, which is closer in terms of its level to the czarist bourgeois economy than to advanced capitalism, end quote, should not be described as socialism either. In conclusion, he called for the renewal of the party by breaking the, quote, dictatorship of the bureaucratic apparatus, end quote. And here we are naturally taken aback. So the party was no longer the, quote, vanguard of the proletariat, and the proletarian dictatorship had therefore been replaced by a bureaucratic dictatorship. But what had become of the, quote, worker state, end quote? New section, section 5. A year earlier, Trotsky had commented on the role and significance of state power by saying that it was, quote, by no means a passive reflection of the economic processes, end quote. That its power could be of enormous progressive significance if it were in the possession of a revolutionary class, although even then it could not abolish the economic processes or the laws of the capitalist world economy. But now state power was no longer in the possession of the working class or the working class's vanguard, but in the power of the, quote, bureaucratic apparatus, end quote. What now? Was the Russian state power now playing not only a, quote, conservative, but also a, quote, reactionary role? We read in Trotsky, quote, after all, the state power remains a weapon of the superstructure. After all, the state power remains a weapon of the superstructure, end quote. Up to now, however, it had been shown that the proletarian character of the state-planned economy is guaranteed by the fact that the state was a workers' state, and it was a workers' state because there was a dictatorship of the proletariat, and there was a dictatorship of the proletariat because it was implemented and exercised by the vanguard of the proletariat, the Bolshevik Party. State power was now in the hands of the bureaucratic apparatus. What did this mean for the social character of the state-planned economy? The substructure. How do Trotsky's, quote, substructure, parenthesis, economy, end parenthesis, and, quote, superstructure, parenthesis, state, end parenthesis, relate to each other? Trotsky writes, quote, politics is a concentrated economy, end quote. Should we now describe the superstructure as a concentrated substructure in view of the weapon of state power? Then state ownership of the means of production is concentrated in the state, as is the state-planned economy, and we are as wise as before. But we also read in Trotsky, quote, the position on the economy is politics, end quote. Can we translate that as the position on the substructure is politics? There is no doubt that the state position on the economy is politics, and in Stalinism this position is, we heard it from Trotsky himself, bureaucratic, conservative, and possibly even reactionary. Does the, quote, substructure remain unaffected by this position? Certainly not, because we heard from Trotsky that state power is not a passive reflection of economic processes. And how does the state power become active? Trotsky answers, quote, the weapon of politics is the party, end quote. As I said, an outdated weapon because the party is supposed to be renewed. And who makes politics if the party fails? We heard it, the bureaucratic apparatus, which apparently also uses the party as a weapon. The party is therefore also a weapon of the superstructure. But the bureaucratic apparatus is also made up of people. Quote, politics is made by people and through people, and nothing human is alien to it, end quote. Trotsky explains. But in the end, these people act as personifications of social forces, even the party people. Quote, the personal contradictions and groupings in the party had already become completely instruments of the impersonal social forces, strata, and classes. The personal contradictions and groupings in the party had already become completely instruments of the impersonal forces, strata, and classes, end quote. Let us now summarize. Although state power is not a passive reflection of the economic processes, the state power cannot abolish the economic processes, but the state can somehow actively influence economic processes. However, it is part of the superstructure, and these economic processes are somehow concentrated in the superstructure. Politics appears, so to speak, as a concentrated expression, as a position on the economy. It uses the party for this purpose, whose internal contradictions, however, only express the socio-economic forces. Does this not mean that we are faced with a primacy of the economy? Section 6. Even in 1932, Trotsky still maintained that the October Revolution and the basic laws of Soviet power had created the, quote, prerequisites for a socialist planned economy. A socialist planned economy, end quote. Not just a statist planned economy. Trotsky evidently saw them in the, quote, state organs of centralized economic management that had been created and functioning over a number of years, end quote. Socialism as, quote, a system, end quote, had thus proven its right to historical victory for the first time. Trotsky saw the, quote, productive advantages, end quote, of fully realized socialism in the, quote, centralization, concentration, unity of the guiding will, end quote. The following prerequisites of the socialist system appeared for the first time in Russia. Quote, 1. The actual state organs, i.e. the hierarchical system of planning commissions. The hierarchical system of planning commissions in the center and in the individual localities. 2. Trade as a system of market regulation. 3. The Soviet bureaucracy, the system of the living influence of the masses on the economic structure. the system of the living influence of the masses on the economic structure, end quote. Yes, we read correctly. Trotsky is not only talking about a council bureaucracy, a monstrous contradictio in ejecto, but about a living influence of the masses on the economic structure of the state-planned economy. Trotsky is also still talking about the, quote, proletariat organized in the state, end quote, and the, quote, worker state, in whose hands all, quote, command levers, end quote, budget, credit, production, trade, are concentrated. But it is Trotsky himself who states that the bureaucracy of Soviet democracy is, quote, surrendered, is, quote, not subject to any control, end quote, and, quote, outsidely commands without restriction, end quote. We read the following description from him, quote, the bureaucracy resorted to ever more decisive bans on all demands, protests, and criticism. The only right it finally left to the workers was the right to exceed the production program set for the factories. The only right it finally left to the workers was the right to exceed the production program set for the factories. Any attempt to influence the economic management from below was immediately presented as a right or left deviation, i.e., practically as a criminal defense, end quote. Trotsky speaks of the, quote, loss of political independence of the workers, end quote, with which they had only come to terms, quote, in anticipation of imminent and decisive socialist successes, end quote. But the critical point is precisely that they had not entered into socialism, quote, we are still far from mastering the methods of systematic regulation. We are only implementing the first rough hypothesis, implementing it poorly and with the lights out. Crises are not only possible for us, they are inevitable. Crises are not only possible for us, they are inevitable. The bureaucracy has already prepared for the coming crisis, end quote. Of the three prerequisites for a socialist planned economy, the third, the active influence of the masses on the economic structure, no longer existed, and the bureaucracy, quote, gave up, end quote, the second, control of the market, just as easily. So all that remains is the hierarchical system of state planning commissions. The only prerequisite for guaranteeing a socialist economic development in Russia is therefore the state-planned economy, the political control of production and possibly distribution exercised by the dictatorship of the bureaucratic apparatus. But Trotsky concluded by emphasizing that the fate of the Soviet Union would be, quote, decided in an indissoluble connection with world developments, end quote, nevertheless held not only to the thesis of the, quote, worker state, parenthesis, equal to the working class organized in the state, end parenthesis, but also to his view of the Soviet Union as a, quote, base of the world revolution, end quote. Trotsky wrote, quote, the enormous importance of the Soviet Union lies in the fact that the Soviet Union forms the base of the world revolution, regardless of whether it succeeds in building socialism or not. End quote. How are we to understand this? In the same essay in which Trotsky explained the Soviet system as essentially a question of property, as a new system of property or economic relations, Trotsky examines the question of whether Russia can return to capitalism at all. Trotsky declares this to be impossible. So if socialism cannot be built, what kind of system do we have? Trotsky admits, however, that the peasants would tolerate a return to industrial capitalism because state industry cannot supply peasants with their products in sufficient quantities or at a reasonable price. But a Russia that has become capitalist again would only be able to occupy a third-class position within world capitalism, parenthesis, 1929, end parenthesis, and now follows such interesting sentences, and now follows such interesting sentences that we would like to quote them all verbatim. Quote, a new Russian capitalism would be a small-scale capitalism, half-colonized without any future. This Russia would today occupy a position roughly between agrarian Russia and present-day India. The Soviet system, however, which has a nationalized industry and a monopoly on foreign trade, is, despite all its contradictions and difficulties, a system for protecting the independence of agriculture and national economy. A system for protecting the independence of agriculture and the national economy. This has also been understood by the many Democrats who were drawn to the side of the Soviet government, not by the socialist idea, but by patriotism, a patriotism that has absorbed the elementary lessons of history. This category also includes the country's numerous technical and intellectual forces and the new school of writers, which I once called Popuchiki, comrades in arms, for a lack of better name, end quote. In this sense, Trotsky declared as early as 1929 that, quote, the Soviet system, regardless of the Soviet system's socialist goals, end quote, was a, quote, guarantee for independent, i.e. non-colonial development, end quote. But had Trotsky not laid down the rule in his autobiography almost at the same time that those Bolsheviks who were patriots during the war of 1914 to 1918, and Democrats after the February Revolution, are today, quote, supporters of Stalin's National Socialism? What if Stalin now saw its historical mission in preserving the independence of the Russian agricultural and national economy, in preventing colonial development? What if, in the form of those personal contradictions and groupings within the Bolshevik Party, behind which, according to Trotsky, the impersonal social forces, strata, and classes of the new Russia were hidden, those numerous technical and intellectual forces, the managers of Soviet Russia and its state-planned economy have prevailed? They can only be guided by a patriotism that has understood the lessons of history and not by the socialist idea. But does the Soviet Union then only constitute a, quote, base of the world revolution? Quote, a base of the world revolution, end quote, insofar as the Soviet Union represents the first victorious colonial revolution through its nationalization of foreign capital. Insofar as it represents the first victorious colonial revolution through its nationalization of foreign capital. And should Soviet Russia be defended, regardless of whether it builds socialism or not, because Soviet Russia's state-planned economy guarantees, quote, independent, i.e. non-colonial, end quote, development, and can serve as a, quote, base for other future colonial revolutions in Asia and Africa. Trotsky accused Varga of the clerical deception that the theory of building socialism in one country is necessary to encourage Russian workers. We ask, should European and American workers perhaps be encouraged to defend the first Eurasian colonial revolution, and all future ones under its leadership, with the theory of the foundations for building socialism in the, quote, worker state, end quote? We will get an answer to these questions when we consider Trotsky's attitude to Stalinist foreign and war policy during World War II. In a letter that, section 7. In a letter that Trotsky wrote after the outbreak of World War II, after the division of Poland between Hitler and Stalin, Trotsky stated that revolutions usually do not change geographical conditions. Therefore, even a, quote, healthy worker state, end quote, would tend to expand, and in the case of Russia, the geographical directions would therefore have to coincide with those of the Tsarist expansion. Comrades who wanted to remove the title of worker state from the USSR because of the Stalin-Hitler pact were just as childish as Stalin when he took away the order of Lenin from a disgraced Bolshevik functionary. Marx's social theory and hysteria were absolutely incompatible. The Stalinist bureaucracy had not yet completely murdered the October Revolution. As far as the invasion of Stalin's soldiers into Poland and other Baltic regions was concerned, one thing was certain, namely a, quote, very progressive fact, end quote. Quote, that neither the Tsar nor Hitler nor Chamberlain have or had the habit of destroying capitalist property in the occupied territories, end quote. Trotsky. It is not the expansion or its geographical direction that Trotsky blames the, quote, Kremlin gangsters, end quote, for, quote, but solely the bureaucratic and counter-revolutionary method of this expansion, the general counter-revolutionary activity of the bureaucracy, end quote. Trotsky. We learn from this that a bureaucracy can be counter-revolutionary, but at the same time progressive. Counter-revolutionary, but at the same time progressive, if the bureaucracy eliminates private property in the occupied territories. Parenthesis, as is well known, the army of the bureaucracy has often done this in, quote, individualist, end quote, forms, end parenthesis. But because the bureaucracy is counter-revolutionary, Trotsky finds it necessary to overthrow it. Footnote. Trotsky, quote, is the transformation of the Soviets into parliamentary democracy probable? That's published in Die Neue Bücherschau in June 1929. And footnote. Shit, that was the wrong footnote. Hold on. God damn it. Trotsky, letter to Comrade Sherman Stanley, signed Crux, October 8th, 1939. That might be on this channel, actually, because I believe that's in, In Defense of Marxism. Back to the text. Maybe we therefore conclude that the Trotskyists would continue this very progressive expansionist policy after the overthrow of Stalinism. There were, of course, some difficulties in the Trotskyist camp itself with such views of Trotsky. It was objected that if the counter-revolutionary Stalinist bureaucracy was running the Soviet Union, then a new category had to be introduced, the, quote, counter-revolutionary workers' state, end quote. It was even raised whether the Stalinist bureaucracy was not a class. The answer to this and other objections given by Trotsky in an essay dated October 18, 1939 is again very revealing. If the, quote, Bonapartist rabble, end quote, in Russia were a class, then this would mean, quote, that it is not an abortion, but a viable child of history, end quote. If the, quote, plundering parasitism, end quote, of this bureaucracy really was exploitation in the scientific sense, then it, quote, means that the bureaucracy has a historical future as a ruling class, end quote. So parasitism cannot be exploitation, because otherwise the bureaucracy would have a historical future as a class. But it cannot be a class, because otherwise the bureaucracy would be a viable child of history instead of a miscarriage, because Trotsky concludes sharply, what cannot be, and that is still called the, quote, defense of Marxism, end quote. Parenthesis, not to mention that the, quote, child, end quote, has been proving its viability for almost 30 years and has asserted itself in a terrible war, end parenthesis. If Trotsky's arguments were already circular, it becomes downright comical when he uses the method of analogy, which is more of a symbolic approach here. Trotsky compares the Soviet Union to a badly damaged but still repairable car. In such a case, one must examine which parts are still good and which are irreparable in order to know how to begin repairing it. Quote, the class-conscious worker will take a similar attitude toward the Soviet Union. He has every right to say that the gangsters of the bureaucracy have turned the worker state into a, quote, devil knows what it is, end quote. But when he passes from this explosive reaction to the solution of the political problem, he is forced to recognize that he has before him a damaged worker state, in which the economic engine is damaged and which still continues to run, and which can be completely restored by replacing some, this isn't in italics, but it says some parts, end quote. You can see that Trotsky's dialectical thinking has here reached ... the car. Quote, of course, this is only an analogy, end quote, Trotsky remarks. But the dialectical category of social totality can at best be represented by an organism, never by a mechanism in which the whole is the mere sum of the mechanical interaction of its parts. This is how mechanists, end quote, this is how mechanists and ... organizers think, exclamation point. Thus Trotsky, undeterred by the objections of the opposition, not only claims that a, quote, workers' state can play a counter-revolutionary role in the international arena, but that it is also imperialist in the traditional, parenthesis, non-Marxist, end parenthesis, sense. Quote, the driving force behind the Moscow bureaucracy is undoubtedly the tendency to extend the Moscow bureaucracy's own power, prestige, and revenue. This is the basic ingredient of, quote, imperialism in the widest sense of the word, a basic ingredient which has been a characteristic of all monarchies, oligarchies, ruling castes, medieval states, and classes in the past, end quote. However, if one understands, parenthesis, with Lenin, end parenthesis, imperialism as the, quote, expansionist policy of finance capital, end quote, then this is not identical with the foreign and war policies of the, quote, Bonapartist bureaucracy, end quote. The correct definition is, quote, politics of a Bonapartist bureaucracy of a degenerated workers' state in imperialist encirclement, end quote. With regard to the Hitler-Stalin pact, however, Trotsky explains under certain circumstances, to a certain degree and in a certain form, quote, support for this or that imperialism is unavoidable even for a completely healthy workers' state, end quote, precisely because of the impossibility of breaking the chains of imperialist world relations, of breaking that imperialist encirclement. This is how Trotsky explains the alliance between Hitler's Germany and Stalin's Russia of the August 23, 1939. Trotsky admits that Moscow is, quote, now busy, end quote, covering up Hitler's plundering policy. Quote, covering up Hitler's plundering policy, end quote. But, Trotsky adds, even this does not, quote, yet turn the USSR into an imperialist state, end quote. Parenthesis, i.e. in the sense of the expansionist policy of, quote, finance capital, end quote, end parenthesis. Finally, Trotsky goes just as far in defending Stalinist Russia, allied with Nazi Germany, as Walter Ulbricht did in February 1940 in the, quote, Welt, parenthesis, Stockholm, end parenthesis. Quote, if England and France were to threaten Leningrad and Moscow tomorrow, the French and English workers should take the most decisive measures to prevent the dispatch of troops and military supplies. If Hitler, by the logic of things, finds himself compelled to send military support to Stalin, on the other hand, the German workers would have little reason in this particular situation to strike or to commit sabotage. I hope no one will propose any other solution, end quote. Trotsky. But if, for example, Hitler were to attempt to seize the Stalinist-ruled Ukraine, the Fourth International would declare, quote, "We will defend the Ukraine enslaved by Stalin against Hitler," end quote. The, quote, "unconditional defense of the USSR," end quote, is part of its program, and according to Trotsky, that means, quote, "that we will defend the social basis of the Soviet Union regardless of the reasons and causes of the war, if it is threatened by imperialism," end quote. Quote, "that we will defend the social basis of the Soviet Union regardless of the reasons and causes of the war, that if it is threatened by imperialism," end quote. This defense refers explicitly and exclusively to the, quote, "workers' state" of the USSR and to the, quote, "things in it that belong to a workers' state," end quote. But did we not see how bad things are? Nevertheless, Trotsky demands of the workers of the imperialist states that they, quote, "must not lose sight of the interest of defending the Soviet Union," parenthesis, "or of the colonial revolutions," end parenthesis, end quote. Trotsky at least sees the theoretical possibility, parenthesis, 1939, exclamation point, end parenthesis, of the complete defeat and collapse of the international workers' movement, in which case the Soviet Union would also have to become an exploitative society in the form of, quote, "bureaucratic collectivism," end quote. If the reactionary forces in society win, then the only possibility is barbarism, quote, "fascism on the one hand, degeneration of the Soviet state on the other, outline the political and social form of neo-barbarism." The social and political form of neo-barbarism, end quote. Trotsky. It's probably from the USSR and war. But to regard this possibility as inevitable would be to be deeply pessimistic. In Trotsky's view, there was no reason for such a pessimism in 1939, as Trotsky refers to the conversation between Hollande and Hitler, published in the weekly edition of the French newspaper Paris Soir on the 31st of August 1939. Wikipedia says Robert Hollande lived from 1885 to 1959 and was a French diplomat who served as the last French ambassador to Germany before World War II. Back to the text. In Trotsky's view, there was no reason for such a pessimism in 1939, as he refers to the conversation between Hollande and Hitler, published in the weekly edition of the French newspaper Paris Soir on the 31st of August 1939. In the last conversation before his departure, the French ambassador warned Hitler of Stalin's double talk and said to him, quote, "The real victor, parenthesis, in case of war, end parenthesis, will be Trotsky. Have you calculated that?" End quote. And Hitler gives the, quote, "astonishing," end quote, answer, quote, "I know," end quote, as if it were a question that had long been decided. Trotsky probably finds this conversation so strange because he interprets it as follows: "The representatives of barbarism have no doubt, quote, that their barbarism will be defeated by the socialist revolution," end quote. Trotsky believes that Hollande has only given the specter of this revolution a personal name. What would Trotsky have said in 1951 about the fact that the Second World War was neither followed by the Socialist Revolution nor by Trotskyism? New section. Section 8. In the year of Trotsky's assassination, 1940, Trotsky published an open letter to Comrade James Burnham, who, together with Comrade Shachtman, began the opposition to Trotsky by raising the question of the nature of the Stalinist state. Parenthesis, we are here at the embryonic stage of his, quote, managerial revolution, end quote, end parenthesis. Only one point from this letter is of interest here. Trotsky claims, parenthesis, citing the Parisian organ of the Mensheviks, end parenthesis, quote, that the advance of the Red Army, parenthesis, in Poland, end parenthesis, was accompanied by a wave of revolutionary upsurge, end quote, which spread to the Romanian peasants, and that the Russian invasion represented a civil war, although it was, quote, brought in from outside on bayonets, end quote, and controlled by the Moscow bureaucracy. Trotsky, open letter to Comrade Burnham. However, since Trotsky in his polemical work From a Scratch to a Cancer, which is from a scratch to gangrene, which is on this channel, a few weeks later dealt even more thoroughly with the Burnham-Shachtman opposition and its theses. The Kremlin's foreign policy is, quote, imperialist. The USSR can no longer be supported, quote, unconditionally. Now that we have dealt with this, we will move on to an examination and consideration of it. From Trotsky's writing, it emerges, first of all, that Shachtman accuses Trotsky of the following. Firstly, that Trotsky is a supporter of a bureaucratic revolution rather than a revolution by the masses. Trotsky is a supporter of bureaucratic revolution rather than a revolution by the masses. Secondly, that Trotsky expresses a tendency to capitulate to Stalinism. Trotsky, on the other hand, accuses Shachtman above all of, quote, following in the footsteps of Burnham, end quote. This, quote, priest of bourgeois science, end quote. But let's get to the point. But where to begin? Let us begin with Shachtman reminding Trotsky of the polemic in which Lenin denied the existence of a pure, quote, worker state and declared that Trotsky was repeating his mistake of 1920 in the discussion about the position of trade unions in relation to the Soviet state. Trotsky first defended himself by saying that Lenin corrected the definition of the Soviet state on the 30th of December 1920. On January 19th, 1921, as follows, quote, I should have said, quote, the worker state in its abstraction. In reality, we have a worker state, firstly with the peculiarity that the country is dominated not by workers but by peasants, and secondly, a worker state with bureaucratic excesses, end quote. Lenin, end quote. Trotsky speaks of a, quote, significant error in the phrase about the definition of the nature of the Soviet state, end quote, and can actually only mean that Lenin first said that in reality there was not a worker state but a workers and peasants state. Strictly speaking, the correction therefore only consists in that the fact that the worker state is not simultaneously a peasant state. Moreover, Trotsky expresses his view that Lenin was wrong in his argument against him at the time, because, quote, there was no difference of opinion between us about the definition of the Soviet state, end quote. What is more important is that the definition from 1920/1921 to today, 1940, is, quote, unchangeably concrete, end quote. Parenthesis, what a dialectic, exclamation point, end parenthesis. And, in connection with the defense of the USSR against imperialism, still obliges the proletariat to defend the existing Russian state. Shachtman expressed the opinion to Trotsky that in connection with the trade union problem, it had been right in 1920/21 to raise the question of the type of state existing in the Soviet Union, and that this was just as right now in connection with the war that broke out in September 1939. One could not repeatedly treat the advanced degree of degeneration of the Soviet regime as irrelevant by pointing to the intact, quote, existence of nationalized property, end quote. Without a doubt, Shachtman has touched on the most sore spot in Trotsky's position. This brings us back to the complex of private and state property, the relationship between the economy and politics. Has Trotsky since modified his previously presented views as a result of his discussion with Burnham and Shachtman? Let us see. In his polemic, we find a section entitled The Abstract and the Concrete, Economy and Politics. Here Trotsky declares that Shachtman is wasting his time trying to prove that nationalized property does not in and of itself automatically, immediately, and directly determine the Kremlin's policy. For the, quote, forms of property, end quote, determine not only politics but the entire intellectual life, quote, through a whole series of intermediate factors and interrelations, end quote. We have already read the phrase, quote, economic or property relations, end quote, in Trotsky, parenthesis 1929, in parenthesis. Here the forms of property seem to have been equated with the economic forms. National property cannot directly determine the Kremlin's policy because there is a contradiction between the social base established by the October Revolution and the tendencies of the state, quote, superstructure. He, Trotsky, had already publicly pointed out the growing contradiction between between the two, 17 years ago. Step by step, he had followed and noted the increasing independence of the bureaucracy from the proletariat, and the bureaucracy's increasing dependence on other classes and groups. Quote, both inside and outside the country, end quote. Yes, at the end of his polemical work, Trotsky even declares, quote, the rule of the Stalinist bureaucracy would be unthinkable without the GPU, the army, the courts, and so on. The Soviet bureaucracy supports Stalin. Precisely because Stalin is the bureaucrat who best defends the bureaucracy's interests, who best defends the Soviet bureaucracy's interests, end quote. Trotsky. What interest then, if Trotsky described the Soviet bureaucracy in 1932, as we remember, as, quote, a system of the living influence of the masses on the economic structure, end quote. Despite this growing dependence of the Stalinist bureaucracy on other classes, parenthesis, which ones, and question mark, end parenthesis, and increasing independence from the working class, Trotsky does not want to give up the thesis of the, quote, workers' state. Trotsky's reasoning reveals his entire Bolshevik, parenthesis, statist, and parenthesis, doctrinarism. Quote, but if, the USSR has completely ceased to be a workers' state, quote, but if, the USSR has completely ceased to be a workers' state, then not a political revolution, parenthesis, only against the, quote, Soviet bureaucracy, end quote, Willy Huhn, and parenthesis, but a social revolution would be necessary, end quote. A social revolution, however, changes the economic structure by overthrowing a ruling class. The consequence which Trotsky rejects is to regard the Stalinist bureaucracy as a new ruling class and its system as a different economic structure. Burnap drew this conclusion and developed his theory of the managerial revolution. Section 9. The actual subject of Trotsky's discussion with the Burnham-Shachtman opposition is not the question of the, quote, worker state per se, but the question, quote, is the Soviet Union still a worker state, albeit degenerate, or has the Soviet Union turned into a new kind of exploitative state? Quote, it is clear that Trotsky and Trotsky's followers are desperately trying to defend themselves against the second alternative for as long as possible, using anthropological and medical terms, quote, degenerate, quote, healthy. Their recognition would overturn the whole of Bolshevik statism. But Trotsky himself has to admit, quote, 1. The features which in 1928 represented a, quote, bureaucratic deformation, end quote, of the Soviet system have today grown into an independent bureaucratic regime. Which has swallowed up the Soviets. 2. The dictatorship of the bureaucracy. Which is incompatible with the internal and international tasks of socialism, has introduced and continues to introduce profound distortions in the economic life of the country. 3. But fundamentally, the system of planned economy based on nationalized ownership of the means of production has been preserved. And continues to represent a colossal achievement of humanity. End quote. Trotsky. We believe, however, that the vicious circle would then only begin again. But Trotsky, as can be seen from his open letter to Comrade Burnham, in line with this perspective, refers to Comrade Shachtman in a letter dated the 20th of January, 1939, quote, the absolute necessity of closely following the internal development of the Stalinist Party, end quote. And in Trotsky's polemic against him, he quotes the following passage from this letter. Quote, I cannot understand why the socialist appeal keeps neglecting the Stalinist Party. The party now represents a mass of contradictions. Splits are inevitable. The next important acquisition, presumably meaning in addition to the Fourth International, Willy Huhn, will certainly come from the Stalinist Party. Our political attention should be concentrated on that, end quote. Trotsky. I believe that, yeah, Trotsky. Since a possible war between imperialist states against Russia would not only liquidate the bureaucratic dictatorship, but also the state-planned economy and divide the country into spheres of influence after their victory, a stabilization of imperialism through this renewed colonization of Russia, and thus a further weakening of the world proletariat, and probably above all the colonial peoples, would be inevitable. But as long as this war does not become a reality, the main task of the Fourth International is, quote, it is necessary to overthrow the bureaucracy. This task can be accomplished only by creating an illegal Bolshevik party in the USSR. This task can be accompanied only by creating an illegal Bolshevik party in the USSR, end quote. From such a perspective, does one not have to get the impression that the guiding principle of the whole Trotskyist policy is the mere reconquest of power in Russia by Trotsky and his followers? We heard from Trotsky that the system of planned economy based on state ownership of the means of production, quote, continues to be a colossal achievement of humanity. Trotsky is so convinced of this that he asked Shachtman a polemical question in a tone of indignation in connection with Russian expansion, without realizing what an interesting problem he is raising. Quote, is Shachtman trying to say, in connection with the USSR, that state ownership of the means of production has become a brake on development, and that the spread of this form of ownership to other countries is an economic reaction? Is Shachtman trying to say, in connection with the USSR, that the state ownership of the means of production has become a brake on development, and that the spread of this form of ownership to other countries is an economic reaction? End quote. Trotsky. Why not? Would such a change contradict the dialectic of history? Private property was once progressive and then turned into a brake on development. Why should state ownership of the means of production not be subject to such a dialectic, when Engels had already stated in 1880, Quote, only in the case where the means of production or transport have really, really outgrown the control of joint stock companies, that is, where nationalization has become economically unavoidable, only in this case does it mean, even if the present state carries it out, an economic advance, the attainment of a new preliminary stage toward the seizure of all productive forces by society itself. The attainment of a new preliminary stage towards the seizure of all productive forces by society itself. End quote. Engels. That's from The Development of Socialism from Utopia to Science. Where then, or I guess socialism, utopian and scientific, but I guess that what I just said is the literal translation of the title from German. Where then is the course of the past 70 years? The seizure of the means of production by society itself has become economically unavoidable, and this is, after all, socialism. Should not the existing state ownership of the means of production have become a hindrance to further development? And could not the extension of Russian state capitalism to more advanced European countries actually have an economic reaction in its wake? State ownership of the means of production, statism, is therefore at best a preliminary stage to social ownership of them, socialism, but the term, quote, property still conceals the crucial fact that the, quote, associations of free and equal producers, end quote, must have direct power over the means of production. This could only be the meaning of Engels' statement that society must move beyond the, quote, formal stage of state ownership of the productive forces, quote, openly and without detours, end quote, i.e. through the state, to take possession of the productive forces. It is the position of social groups in the production process that constitutes them as classes. Only post festum are these positions legally codified, i.e. presented as property relations. Trotsky, on the other hand, identifies class and property relations, writing, quote, class, property, relations, end quote. And, quote, economic or, quote, property, end quote, relations, end quote. For this reason, mere state ownership of the means of production can currently only create a socialist foundation in the sense of a, quote, jurist socialism, end quote, Engels. In fact, this is only created with the first, if perhaps only partial, power of disposal of the productive forces by the producers. New section, section 10. Let us now consider, in the light of these Marxist views, Trotsky's further remarks on the, quote, worker state, its expansion and its defense. It would seem that there is little objection to his following sentence, quote, a planned economy freed from national constraints on the basis of socialized property is the task of the international proletariat, but above all in Europe, end quote. Trotsky. If only one did not understand, quote, socialization to mean, quote, nationalization, and Trotsky himself did, Trotsky immediately devalues this sentence himself by comparing the, quote, bureaucratic methods of the Kremlin, end quote, in, quote, expropriating the property owners in Poland and Finland, end quote, with the, quote, dynastic methods of the Hohenzollerns in unifying Germany, end quote. Quote, between the defense of reactionary forms of property by reactionary means and the introduction of progressive forms of property by bureaucratic methods, we, choose the lesser evil, end quote. Trotsky. In any case, bureaucratic methods are being used here as a means of introducing progressive forms of property, And since this involves the implementation of nationalization measures, i.e., an extension of bureaucratic power, the bureaucrats will be happy if they are certified as having brought about progress. But it is the same bureaucracy that Trotsky accuses of, quote, the defense of its own parasitic interests. The defense of its own parasitic interest occupies the first and most decisive place in the bureaucracy's present foreign and domestic policy. The most decisive place in the bureaucracy's present foreign and domestic policy. We're waging a deadly war against this, but in the final analysis, despite the interests of the bureaucracy, the interests of the workers' state are reflected in a very distorted form. The interests of the workers' state are reflected in a very distorted form, end quote. This applies, as I have said, to Russia's armed intervention in eastern Poland under the Hitler-Stalin Pact and its invasion of Finland. Even under such circumstances, the Fourth International defends the interests of the workers' state because, regardless of the aims of this or that government, regardless of the causes that may lead to war, writes Trotsky, the present war, quote, between the USSR and the capitalist world, end quote, parenthesis 1940, end parenthesis, also involves the fate of those, quote, historical achievements, end quote, that, quote, we defend unconditionally. Unconditionally, that is, in spite of the reactionary policy of the bureaucracy, end quote. Of course, we already know these historical achievements, quote, state property and the monopoly of foreign trade, end quote. The interests of the workers' state are obviously identical with these. Thus, Trotsky claims that the Red Army's invasion of eastern Poland on the 17th of September 1939 triggered a, quote, bureaucratic impulse towards socialist revolution, end quote, and that this would not have been possible if the bureaucracy had not, presumably, quote, in final analysis, end quote, its roots in a workers' state, end quote. This is actually true, for we have seen that the definition of, quote, workers' state is based solely on state ownership of the means of production and on the state monopoly of foreign trade, and both of these are in fact the legal, quote, roots, end quote, of the bureaucracy. But what did the social upheaval consist of in the areas occupied by the Stalinist army? Western Belorussia and Western Ukraine, parenthesis, formerly Eastern Poland, end parenthesis, elected a national assembly. Quote, the election program, which is of course dictated by the Kremlin, contained three extremely important points: the annexation of both provinces to the Federation of the USSR, the confiscation of the manors in favor of the peasants, and nationalization of heavy industry and the banks, end quote. I don't know who the quote's from. It was essentially the program of agrarian revolution of an industrially backward country, such as would crop up again and again throughout Eurasia, often even with the first point, if the country was in the sphere of influence of Russia. But Trotsky explains that the Kremlin, which dictated the election program, was, quote, nothing other than the social basis of the Soviet Union, to a social revolutionary program, end quote. Forced, exclamation point. Despite his alliance with National Socialism, he carried out those changes. I guess he being Trotsky, being Stalin. But in what sense did, quote, the social basis of the Soviet Union, end quote, force the Kremlin bureaucracy to carry out the social revolution in eastern Poland? Trotsky himself gives a clear answer, quote, if it had not done this, it would not have been able to absorb the country into the USSR, end quote. Trotsky. But as is well known, there have been expropriations of large landed property for the benefit of the peasants and nationalizations of banks and heavy industry in other countries whose states also have bureaucracies that are independent of the proletariat and dependent on other classes and groups. But we have never heard that the workers should defend the, quote, socialist foundations, end quote, of these countries. In his polemic against Shachtman, Trotsky himself quotes several paragraphs from the New York Times about former Eastern Poland, which also include the following sentences, quote, in industry, drastic acts of expropriation have not yet been carried out on a large scale. The main centers of the banking system, the railway system, and a number of larger industrial enterprises were nationalized years before the Russian occupation. In smaller and medium-sized industries, the workers now exercise control over production, end quote. In the small and medium-sized industries, the workers are allowed to control production, but not in the largest and nationalized industries. But what follows from the fact that no extensive expropriations took place in industry after the Russian occupation, and this despite the programmatic demand for the nationalization of heavy industry and the banks? Was this perhaps because the main banks, the railways, and large industrial enterprises had already been expropriated by the capitalist Polish state before the Red Army invaded, and thus, quote, a colossal achievement of humanity, end quote, had already been achieved? So the only essential point of the social changes triggered by the Red Army in Eastern Poland is the, quote, agrarian revolution, end quote, which Trotsky also deals with in more detail. But what does the spread of Eurasian peasant revolutions and the state capitalist construction of large-scale national industry arising from them have to do with the establishment and defense or expansion of a, quote, workers' state, end quote? Even with Trotsky himself, nothing was left to the workers' state except the state-planned economy based on state ownership of the means of production. The Socialist Workers' Party in the United States was already discussing whether the definition of, quote, workers' state could still be retained, but was already declaring that, quote, the planned economy must continue to be defended, end quote. We now understand that they are really consistent Trotskyists. The definition of quote, worker state is not as worthy of defense as the state-planned economy and state ownership of the means of production, ... For statists, that is. Comrade Natalia Trotsky was right to turn away from the Trotskyists, but Natalia Trotsky could not do so in the name and spirit of Trotsky. Even from the perspective of the, quote, deepest historical pessimism, end quote, the view of Russia as a neo-barbaric system, the theoretical possibility of a society of exploitation that is neither bourgeois nor socialist, based on, quote, bureaucratic collectivism, end quote, Trotsky would not yet lead to the conclusion that the thesis of the unconditional defense of the Soviet Union should be abandoned if and so long as the state-planned economy and state ownership of the means of production still exist in it. Therefore, we must contradict Natalia Trotsky when Natalia Trotsky declares to the Trotskyists that she does not see any of Trotsky's ideas in their politics. There are, unfortunately, just too many of them, and the worst thing, even during Trotsky's lifetime, they were, quote, old and outdated formulations, end quote. The new workers' movement will be able to do without both the formulas of Trotskyism and the Trotskyist officers to carry out its tasks. That's the end of the piece. Thank you so much for listening.